What if everything you think you know about medieval rebellions is missing the most disturbing part? The part that was deliberately erased because it exposed a fear the feudal world could never admit. Imagine discovering that rebellious peasant women were not only punished, but subjected to forms of violence so calculated, so personal, that even the feudal lords themselves hesitated to record them. This opening crack in the historical stone forces us to confront a past where power was absolute, where the line between discipline and cruelty dissolved whenever a woman dared to defy the order. And it raises a deeper question. Why were these specific acts pushed into silence, and what does that reveal about the power these women truly held? Before exploring the brutality itself, we need to step inside the medieval village, where poverty, famine, and forced labor shaped every breath. Women were expected to obey, to endure, to survive without complaint. But history shows moments when patience broke, when women organized, shouted, fought back. These were not accidents. They were the spark that terrified an entire hierarchy built on submission. Once a woman rebelled, the punishment unleashed on her carried a message meant to echo through every hut, every field, every family. This is where the forgotten cruelty begins to take shape, a cruelty designed not just to punish, but to break the memory of resistance itself. As we pull back the layers of this hidden past, every detail becomes a key. The reactions of the lords, the absence of these stories in official chronicles, the whispers preserved only through oral memory, all of them reveal a truth that was never meant to survive. You may start to sense that what happened to these women was not simply punishment, but a structured mechanism of fear, crafted over generations. And once you understand the weight of that system, you begin to see why uncovering these stories is essential to understanding medieval society as a whole. These women were more powerful than the records allow us to see, and that power is exactly why their suffering was obscured. Before we go deeper, I want to know what you think so far. Have you ever felt that history hides the most important parts simply because they challenge the narrative we were taught? If this beginning already makes you question what really happened, tell me in the comments. Your perspective helps shape this investigation, so make sure you leave a like and check if you are already subscribed to the channel. What you will uncover next may surprise you, and the path we are about to follow only becomes more revealing from here, moving us closer to the truth buried beneath centuries of silence. To understand why rebellious peasant women provoked such disproportionate reactions, we need to look at the roots of their defiance, roots woven into centuries of oppression that the feudal system depended on. Life in medieval villages was a complex balance between endurance and obligation. Women were responsible for harvesting, grinding grain, preparing food, gathering firewood, repairing clothing, raising children, managing livestock, and holding households together, while men were forced into endless labor or conscripted for the lord's demands. When famine struck, when taxes increased without warning, when forced labor intensified, it was often women who first felt the system crushing their survival. And it was often women who saw no alternative but to resist. Rebellions did not emerge from dramatic speeches or heroic figures. They began with whispered conversations around communal ovens, long exchanges at the well, quiet outrage turning into shared intention. Women observed patterns of exploitation more closely than anyone else. They knew when grain had been overtaxed, when a steward abused his power, when a decree from the manor crossed the invisible line between suffering and unendurable injustice. This awareness created a form of organic leadership that frightened the feudal hierarchy. Women were not supposed to notice, question, or challenge anything, yet they did. As tensions grew, these acts of disobedience became the spark for collective unrest. Sometimes the trigger was the confiscation of food. Sometimes a lord demanded additional days of unpaid service. Other times it was punishment inflicted on a child or husband, But behind each rebellion lay the same underlying truth. Women recognized when their communities were being pushed beyond survival, and they acted. This made their resistance unpredictable, decentralized, and dangerously effective. The chronicles written by monks rarely acknowledged this dynamic. They preferred to portray rebellions as spontaneous chaos or as male-driven disruptions to the divine order. But the testimonies preserved through oral memory reveal another story. Women were often the first to organize food distribution during shortages, the first to refuse impossible quotas, and the first to push others to challenge unjust commands. Their rebellion was not loud, but it was persistent, strategic, and deeply rooted in the defense of life itself. This is why the feudal lords reacted with such palpable fear. A rebellion led by men could be crushed through brute force and military punishment. But women represented something different. Their networks were invisible. Their motivations were grounded in survival. Their actions carried moral authority that threatened to undermine the entire structure of feudal dominance. The lords understood that once women realized the power they held together, the system would begin to crumble from within. And so the seeds of brutal retaliation were planted, preparing the way for the punishments designed specifically to silence them. Everything that followed carried the imprint of this fear, shaping a form of repression that went far beyond physical violence and into psychological control, social fragmentation, and the deliberate erasure of female agency across generations. The cruelty that would come next was not spontaneous. It was calculated, forged through the recognition that these women, if left unchecked, could alter the course of the entire feudal world. As we move deeper into the hidden machinery of feudal control, the first layer of punishments inflicted on rebellious peasant women reveals how the system operated with a cold and calculated precision. These punishments were never random. They formed a structured response, designed to re-establish dominance while keeping the brutality concealed behind the facade of order, faith, and tradition. At this stage, the violence was masked as discipline, wrapped in rituals that appeared lawful, even necessary, to the medieval mind. But once we look closely, it becomes clear that these acts were crafted to target not only the body, but the identity and dignity of the women involved. The initial forms of punishment often took place inside the manor's administrative spaces, rather than in open squares. Lords preferred to exert control away from the public eye, especially when the accused were women. Interrogations were framed as moral correction or spiritual guidance, but their real purpose was to break resistance and instill fear. Women were forced to confess to disruptions they had not caused, to accept blame for shortages or disputes they had merely witnessed. Confession was the first weapon, used to create the illusion that the punishment was deserved, an essential tactic to prevent community outrage. Another common method involved forced labor beyond already unbearable routines. Instead of working in the fields, rebellious women were ordered to dig drainage trenches in frozen ground, carry bundles of wet wood up steep hills, or grind grain through the night without rest. These tasks were chosen not for their productivity, but for their ability to exhaust the spirit. The intention was clear: to turn the act of rebellion into a memory intertwined with physical agony, ensuring that even the thought of defiance became synonymous with suffering. But the real cruelty lay in how these punishments manipulated social bonds. A woman accused of rebellion could be temporarily separated from her children, placed under surveillance in a neighboring household, or assigned to duties far from her community's routine. This fragmentation of everyday life was deliberate. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, isolating a woman from her network was as devastating as physical pain. It planted suspicion inside the village, as neighbors wondered if speaking to her might draw the Lord's scrutiny. Isolation became a silent weapon, turning the community itself into part of the punishment. The religious framework of the time added another layer of violence. Priests, aligned with the manor's interests, delivered sermons condemning disobedience, hinting that rebellious women risked not only earthly punishment, but eternal consequences. These messages, delivered in dim churches filled with smoke from tallow candles, shaped the perception of guilt long before any official penalty was pronounced. Through this blend of spiritual intimidation and social manipulation, the system ensured that the woman's suffering appeared justified, even when the community quietly sensed that something was deeply wrong. This first layer of punishment served as a warning. It demonstrated how the feudal world preferred subtle cruelty before escalating into open brutality. Yet even here, in these early stages, we see the framework of a society terrified of female resistance. These punishments were carefully designed to control without drawing suspicion, to destroy resolve while maintaining the illusion of order. And as the pressure intensified, the methods would grow far more explicit, exposing the raw fear that lay beneath the surface of medieval authority. As the first layer of hidden punishments failed to silence resistance, feudal authorities escalated their methods, moving from controlled private intimidation to forms of public humiliation specifically crafted to target women. These acts were not only physical, but symbolic, meant to fracture dignity in front of the very community that once relied on these women as pillars of survival. When a woman challenged the manor, the punishment that followed was designed to reshape her identity in the eyes of others, transforming her from a respected figure into a warning etched into collective memory. One of the most common practices was forced exposure, where a woman was paraded through the village carrying objects associated with her supposed transgression. If she protested against taxation, she might be forced to drag a broken yoke. If she confronted a steward, she might wear an exaggerated wooden collar. These objects were deliberately oversized, heavy, and uncomfortable, ensuring each step of the humiliation left a physical mark. The spectacle was crafted to suggest that her rebellion had disrupted the natural order, and that only public shame could restore it. Another method involved being tied to symbolic structures such as mill wheels, granary posts, or the central well, all elements essential to village life. By binding a woman to these spaces, the authorities sent a message that she had attacked the very foundation of communal stability. Villagers were often required to pass by while she remained restrained for hours or even days. The cruelty lay not only in the act itself, but in the forced participation of witnesses who depended on those same structures for their survival. This transformed daily routines into instruments of psychological punishment, ensuring that the memory of her humiliation became intertwined with the rhythm of the community. Voice, too, was turned into a weapon. Women accused of rebellion were sometimes forced to recite scripted confessions that they did not believe, repeating phrases crafted to reinforce their supposed inferiority. These rehearsed humiliations were meant to fracture identity from within, compelling women to speak words that contradicted their own experiences. The psychological weight of such punishments often lingered far longer than physical wounds, shaping how a woman perceived herself long after the spectacle ended. Clothing played a central role in these rituals. Women were stripped of their ordinary garments and forced to wear coarse sacks, torn shawls, or outfits marked with chalk, patterns symbolizing disruption or disobedience. The transformation was deliberate, turning a woman's appearance into a public statement of disgrace. Clothing, which normally protected dignity, became a visual tool for the authorities to rewrite her role in the community. Yet perhaps the most devastating part of public humiliation was that it did not end when the punishment concluded. Women returned to households where whispers lingered, where neighbors struggled between solidarity and fear of drawing attention. The aftermath carried its own form of violence, as these women navigated a world that had been taught to see them through a distorted lens imposed by the manor. And despite all this, many women resisted again. The system, however, continued refining its methods, preparing to escalate into even harsher forms of repression when humiliation failed to extinguish defiance. What comes next reveals not only the fear that women awakened in feudal lords, but also the desperate lengths those in power reached to maintain control. Before we move on, I would like to know your thoughts. Which part of this public humiliation struck you the most, and why do you think these rituals were so effective at reshaping entire communities? Share your perspective in the comments. When public humiliation failed to suppress defiance, the feudal system revealed its darkest layers, escalating from symbolic punishment to outright violence that reshaped the very meaning of rebellion. At this stage, the response to female resistance became far more deliberate, blending corporal pain with psychological domination to ensure that the community witnessed not only the punishment itself, but the message behind it. The escalation was never impulsive. It emerged from a refined understanding of how fear traveled through families, how suffering transmitted warnings across generations, and how cruelty could be calibrated to extinguish even the quietest spark of dissent. This shift often began with the involvement of stewards and armed retainers who enforced the manor's authority. Women accused of leading food protests, refusing impossible labor quotas, or encouraging others to resist were subjected to beatings carried out with tools associated with agricultural discipline, wooden flails, rope whips, or woven sticks used for driving livestock. The choice of tools was symbolic. By blending agricultural objects with violence, the authorities sent a message that even the tools of daily survival could be used to restore obedience. The blows were calculated to avoid fatal injuries while still producing long-lasting pain, bruises, and limitations that interfered with work, pushing the community into deeper hardship. But physical violence was only part of the escalation. Feudal lords increasingly relied on confinement as a weapon, placing women in crude storage sheds, cellars, or abandoned granaries transformed into improvised detention spaces. These structures were unfit for habitation, often damp and infested with rodents. Confinement could last hours or days, long enough to inflict psychological disorientation and physical exhaustion. The darkness, the cold, the isolation, and the uncertainty about release produced a form of punishment that lingered long after the door reopened. It was not simply imprisonment. It was a carefully engineered descent into vulnerability that the authorities used to break resolve. In some regions, the escalation included the practice of binding women to the manor's outer walls or roadside posts, exposed to weather, animals, and the gaze of travelers from neighboring villages. Being displayed beyond the boundaries of one's own community intensified the shame, suggesting to outsiders that the woman posed a threat that had required exceptional restraint. These scenes reinforced the impression that female rebellion was dangerous enough to cross territorial lines, shaping a narrative of fear that spread far beyond the village itself. Psychological torment became even more pronounced as punishments intensified. Authorities threatened to confiscate a family's grain, livestock, or tools if the woman resisted interrogation. They warned husbands or sons that their own labor rights might be revoked, subtly pressuring families to participate in the suppression of the woman's defiance. This manipulation fractured households, forcing loved ones to choose between supporting her or protecting their survival. The punishment, therefore, extended beyond the individual, becoming a mechanism that rewrote social bonds through fear. Religious rhetoric intensified alongside these practices. Clerics invoked divine authority to justify escalating cruelty, framing female rebellion as a spiritual threat rather than a response to exploitation. Sermons described disobedient women as agents of disorder capable of weakening the village's relationship with God. This framing encouraged communities to accept the violence, even if they internally questioned it, because resisting the punishment now felt equivalent to resisting divine instruction. By combining these layers, feudal authorities created a system of escalating violence that struck at the physical, social, and spiritual core of female identity. The goal was not simply to punish rebellion, but to reshape the community's relationship with power, ensuring that the memory of resistance became entangled with suffering. And yet, even under this growing brutality, many women continued to push back, forcing the system to develop punishments that were even more invasive, more symbolic, and more deeply rooted in the desire to control the narrative of history itself. As violence escalated beyond physical punishment, the feudal system employed a set of ritualized practices meant not only to discipline rebellious women, but to inscribe obedience into the very fabric of the community. These rituals were crafted with chilling precision, blending superstition, public performance, and symbolic degradation to transform each punishment into an enduring lesson. Feudal lords understood that physical pain faded, but rituals lingered, embedding themselves in memory, folklore, and daily routine. Through these orchestrated acts, they attempted to convert rebellion into a spectacle that reinforced the hierarchy and warned every witness that dissent would reshape their lives in ways far more profound than bruises or lash marks. One of the most striking elements of these rituals was their purposeful slowness. Unlike immediate violence, ritual punishment unfolded over hours, sometimes even days, as if the community itself had to participate in the process of breaking a woman's resistance. A woman accused of leading a protest or defying a steward might be required to walk the perimeter of the village with her hands bound, stopping at symbolic landmarks: the church door, the communal oven, the granary, the crossroads. Each location represented a facet of village life, and by forcing her to pause at each point, the authorities turned her punishment into a map of obedience, drawing invisible lines between her suffering and the spaces the community relied upon. Chanting or recitation often accompanied these rituals, further deepening their psychological impact. Women were compelled to repeat phrases crafted to reinforce their supposed guilt, echoing words that contradicted their experiences. Villagers, under pressure from the manor, sometimes had to respond with predetermined lines or gestures. In these moments, the entire community became part of the ritual, not by choice, but by social coercion. It blurred the boundaries between victim and witness, transforming collective life into a stage where power performed its most sophisticated form of domination. Objects also played a central role in these ritualized punishments. A woman might be forced to carry a bucket with holes, symbolizing the futility of resisting the Lord's authority, or drag a bundle of thorny branches meant to represent the burden of disobedience. These objects were rarely practical. Their purpose was symbolic, amplifying the humiliation through metaphor. Over time, these symbols became part of local folklore, described in whispered stories that warned young girls about the consequences of stepping outside the defined roles of obedience. Water and fire, two essential elements of medieval life, were frequently incorporated into these rituals. Women might be forced to stand in icy streams while reciting confessions, invoking the idea of purification through suffering. Others were positioned near hearth fires until heat and smoke stung their skin and eyes, symbolizing moral cleansing. These practices blurred the lines between punishment and superstition, persuading villagers that the ritual itself had spiritual meaning, even when it served primarily as a political tool to reinforce hierarchy. What made these rituals especially destructive was the way they manipulated identity. A woman who underwent such punishment often returned to her home with new labels imposed upon her by the community. She might be called marked, cleansed, or warned, terms that carried social implications long after the ritual ended. These labels shaped how neighbors interacted with her, how children approached her in the streets, and how she navigated daily life. Punishment thus extended far beyond the moment of ritual. It became a permanent part of her social existence. By embedding punishment within ritual, feudal authorities ensured that rebellion was not simply punished, but absorbed into the collective consciousness. The goal was to create a world where even the idea of resistance felt dangerous, unreasonable, or spiritually corrupt. And yet, despite these efforts, Many women continued to challenge the system, demonstrating a resilience that the rituals themselves inadvertently revealed. The more elaborate the performance of power became, the more it exposed the depth of fear driving those who commanded it. As the feudal world sought more sophisticated ways to suppress rebellion, its legal system became a weapon disguised as order. Far from being neutral or protective, medieval law was often manipulated to justify violence against women who dared to defy the manor's authority. This transformation of law into an instrument of fear allowed feudal lords to present their brutality as justice, cloaking acts of domination behind parchment, seals, and the language of divine legitimacy. What appeared to be legal procedure on the surface was, in reality, a calculated effort to silence women while maintaining the illusion of fairness. The first distortion came through the definitions of wrongdoing. Acts that posed no threat to public safety were reframed as crimes against the stability of the realm. A woman refusing an impossible labor demand could be accused of disturbing the peace. A protest over grain distribution could be reinterpreted as incitement to disorder. Even speaking out during a village assembly could be labeled insubordination, a charge heavy enough to justify punishment, but vague enough to be applied at will. These inflated definitions allowed the authorities to punish women without admitting fear, projecting the idea that female defiance was not a response to injustice, but a moral flaw that required correction. Trials themselves were theater. Women were rarely given the chance to speak freely, and when they did, their words were recorded selectively or distorted by scribes loyal to the manor. Witnesses were pressured into conformity, either through threats or subtle reminders of their dependence on the Lord's protection. Accusations turned into statements of fact the moment they were written down. In this environment, the legal process functioned not as a search for truth, but as a mechanism to reinforce the hierarchy. Punishments delivered through the legal system carried an aura of inevitability. A sentence framed as a lawful judgment appeared more acceptable to the community than raw violence. This made it easier for the manor to implement harsh consequences. Extended forced labor, public shaming, confinement, or ritualized punishment disguised as moral correction. Written records also allowed the authorities to give the impression that due process had been followed, even when the outcome had been predetermined long before the woman ever stood before a judge or steward. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of this legal manipulation was how it shaped collective memory. Chronicles preserved in monasteries recorded only the sanitized version of events, portraying rebellious women as disruptive, hysterical, or dangerous, stripping them of context or humanity. These documents then became the foundation for later historical interpretations, ensuring that centuries of scholars would inherit a distorted narrative that erased the realities of oppression. The law did not simply punish, it rewrote history, redefining female resistance as moral failure rather than survival. This systemic distortion also placed pressure on families, who feared that defending an accused woman might bring legal consequences upon themselves. Husbands, brothers, and neighbors often remained silent, not out of agreement with the punishment, but out of fear of being drawn into the same legal machinery. The law, therefore, succeeded where punishment alone could not. It isolated the woman from her social support network, making her vulnerability appear natural rather than engineered. By weaponizing legal authority, the feudal hierarchy perfected a subtler, more enduring form of violence. The brutality could be hidden behind ink and parchment, concealed within sermons, normalized through repetition. And as these legal distortions spread, they shaped the foundation for even deeper acts of erasure and manipulation that would influence how history remembered, or deliberately forgot, the women who resisted. Before we continue, I would like to hear from you. Which part of this legal manipulation do you think had the most lasting impact on how these women were remembered? Share your thoughts in the comments. As legal distortions tightened their grip on medieval society, Another layer of control emerged, one that proved even more enduring than violence or punishment: the deliberate manipulation of written history. While the law punished rebellious women in the moment, the chronicles ensured that future generations would forget they had ever resisted at all. This erasure was not accidental. It was a strategic effort to shape collective memory, to rewrite the past in a way that preserved the authority of the feudal elite while concealing the depth of female defiance that once rattled their power. Monastic scribes, responsible for recording daily events, battles, disputes, and moral lessons, played a central role in this process. Their writings were not neutral observations but carefully curated narratives that reflected the interests of those who funded and protected them. When women rebelled, the chroniclers rarely wrote about the conditions that drove them to act. They omitted the shortages, the abuses of stewards, the impossibility of labor demands, and the quiet organization among women that preceded unrest. Instead, they focused on the disruption itself, portraying female resistance as irrational chaos or sinful disobedience that required firm correction. This selective recording produced a distorted landscape of memory. When a woman defended her village's grain reserves during famine, scribes described her as a provocateur. When she encouraged neighbors to refuse an unjust decree, they wrote of her as a danger to divine order. When she organized others to challenge a steward's corruption, she became a footnote of disorder rather than an agent of justice. Over time, these subtle shifts reshaped how rebellion was understood, framing it not as a struggle for survival, but as a moral failure embedded in the character of the women themselves. The manipulation extended beyond omission. Chroniclers often exaggerated male protagonism, attributing revolts sparked by women to unnamed male leaders or groups of villagers. This reassignment of agency reinforced patriarchal expectations, allowing the record to remain comfortable, predictable, and aligned with feudal ideology. In cases where women could not be entirely excluded, their roles were minimized, described as emotional reactions rather than strategic decisions. Their leadership was reframed as hysteria, their courage as disorder, their suffering as divine punishment. What made this manipulation particularly effective was the trust medieval society placed in the written word. Most villagers were illiterate, relying on clergy for access to knowledge. When priests read chronicles aloud during religious gatherings, these biased accounts became communal truth. Over generations, oral memory faded while written records remained, creating a historical landscape where female rebellion appeared rare, insignificant, or morally corrupt. The real stories of organization, resilience, intelligence, and shared defiance were pushed into shadows where only fragments survived in whispers and folklore. The impact of this manipulation extended far beyond the medieval period. Later historians, often unaware of the distortions embedded in these documents, repeated the narratives without questioning their origins. As a result, entire centuries of female resistance disappeared from mainstream historical understanding. The very women who shaped their communities, defended their families, and confronted injustice were transformed into background figures or erased entirely. The chroniclers had succeeded in their goal, crafting a history that justified the hierarchy and concealed the fear that female rebellion once instilled in feudal lords. Yet despite this massive effort to control memory, traces of truth survived in unexpected places. Folk songs, regional legends, household stories, and marginal notes scribbled by frustrated monks hinted at a submerged reality. These fragments reveal a world far more complex, where women were not passive observers of history, but active participants whose resistance challenged the very structure of feudal power. And it is within these forgotten echoes that the next layers of this hidden story begin to reemerge, pointing to consequences that extended long after the punishments ended. As the written record distorted the past and buried the truth about female rebellion, the consequences of this systemic cruelty took root in the fabric of medieval society. The brutality inflicted on rebellious peasant women did not end with their punishment or their erasure from chronicles. Instead, it shaped the psychological landscape of entire communities, altering social structures, personal identities, and generational memory. These consequences were subtle yet devastating, echoing long after the physical wounds healed and the public humiliations faded from daily conversation. Families carried the weight of fear even when no one spoke of it openly. Children who had witnessed their mothers or aunts subjected to ritual punishment grew up with a learned caution, a sense that the world was fragile and that resistance could unravel the stability of their household. Sons internalized the warning that defending a woman might threaten their own survival. Daughters absorbed patterns of silence that taught them obedience long before they understood the meaning of the word. In this way, the feudal system used the suffering of a few to construct psychological boundaries for many, crafting a culture where submission was inherited, like property. Communities, too, felt the long-term effects. Villages that had once relied on cooperation found themselves divided by suspicion. The isolation imposed on rebellious women during their punishment often persisted afterward, not because neighbors agreed with the manner's actions, but because fear had become a permanent presence. A glance exchanged at the well, a whispered conversation near the granary, a moment of hesitation during communal work, each carried the possibility of drawing unwanted attention. This subtle tension fragmented bonds that had been essential for survival, weakening the collective strength that once held villages together. Gender roles hardened under the weight of these consequences. As chronicles portrayed female descent as chaos and legal systems defined it as crime, the idea of women as political actors faded from acceptable imagination. The social cost of rebellion became so high that women learned to negotiate power in indirect ways, through quiet influence rather than open defiance. While this adaptability showed resilience, it also revealed how deeply the consequences of violence shaped their possibilities. The system succeeded in narrowing the space for visible female leadership, pushing it into hidden corners of domestic life where it was less likely to provoke retaliation. The psychological scars extended far beyond individuals. Fear became woven into rituals, traditions, and even language. Expressions warning women to stay within their roles carried echoes of past punishments. Proverbs about obedience and modesty, often repeated casually, reinforced the lessons taught through violence centuries earlier. These cultural patterns did not emerge organically. They were the result of deliberate strategies that transformed temporary acts of brutality into lasting tools of social control. Yet within these consequences, traces of resistance endured. Women who had witnessed cruelty sometimes became silent protectors of others, offering food, shelter, or advice in moments of danger. Stories whispered at night carried subtle messages of defiance, reminding younger generations that the pain they saw had once been tied to an attempt to defend dignity and survival. Though these whispers rarely reached the written record, they circulated through families and households, keeping alive a memory the chroniclers tried to extinguish. The long-term consequences also revealed a deeper paradox. The more the feudal system attempted to suppress rebellion, the more it revealed its own fragility. Violent punishment, legal manipulation, and historical erasure were not signs of confidence but of fear. They exposed the anxiety of a hierarchy built on unstable foundations, terrified of what might happen if women refused to conform to the roles assigned to them. And it is within this tension, between fear and control, silence and memory, that the final layers of this hidden history unfold, revealing how the remnants of these acts continued shaping the world long after the medieval age faded into the past. As the traces of these stories resurface in fragments, it becomes clear that the violence inflicted on rebellious peasant women was not simply a collection of isolated events, but a structural force that shaped the medieval world in profound ways. The silence surrounding their suffering did not erase its impact. Instead, it shifted the weight of those experiences into the corners of culture where history rarely looks. In the fears passed from mother to daughter, in the patterns of obedience that quietly shaped households, in the gaps where chronicles should have recorded acts of courage, but instead chose omission. These women left imprints not through recognition, but through the distortions their resistance forced upon the system that oppressed them. Uncovering these hidden layers allows us to see the medieval world not as the orderly hierarchy portrayed in official records, but as a landscape of tension in which ordinary women held far more influence than the chroniclers were willing to admit. Their defiance, whether through protest, refusal, organization, or simple endurance, revealed the fragility of a system that depended entirely on silence and submission. Each act of rebellion, no matter how small, forced the authorities to react with greater intensity, exposing their fear of losing control. And though the consequences were severe, the persistence of these women shows that power in the medieval world was never as one-sided as history made it seem. This rediscovery also raises uncomfortable questions about how many other voices have been buried under centuries of selective storytelling. If these women could be erased so thoroughly that their courage survived only through whispers, what else might have been hidden in the shadows of history? And how might our understanding of the past change if those suppressed perspectives were brought to light? These questions linger, reminding us that the archives we trust were shaped by people with their own fears, loyalties, and intentions. By recognizing these patterns of distortion, we begin to see the medieval world through a sharper, more honest lens, one that includes the lives and struggles of those who lived at the margins yet carried the weight of entire communities. As these stories come into focus, the silence that once obscured them loses its power. What remains is a deeper awareness of the human cost behind feudal authority, a recognition of the resilience embedded in the lives of women who refused to be broken, and an invitation to continue, questioning the narratives we inherit. Their suffering was not a footnote. It shaped the world around them in ways that still echo today, influencing cultural norms, social expectations, and even the frameworks through which history has long been written. If you reach this point, I would like you to leave a comment saying something like, "I stayed until the end, so I know you were here with me through the entire journey of uncovering these hidden stories." And if this exploration brought you new insight or helped you see medieval history from a different perspective, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps bring forward more forgotten experiences and voices that deserve to be heard. A like on the video also goes a long way in helping this content reach others who might connect with these stories. And if you want to keep diving into this world of hidden truths and rediscovered histories, there is another video here that continues this exploration from a different angle. You can click and come with me there as we keep unraveling what the past tried so hard to conceal.